Welcome. I'm Mark Tutors, an assistant professor in media studies, where I study political subcultures at the bottom of the web. And it is my pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speakers, Mitchell Dean and Luiza Bialasiewicz, to discuss anti-lockdown protests and the geopolitics of Statephobia. This event is co-sponsored by SPOW 25 and the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. And it is the first in a series of 3 events. Subsequent to this, there will be another event looking at the longer histories of state phobia, and then an event after that on rethinking the state post-COVID. So tonight's event is the culmination of an idea from this that took root this past summer when Luiza invited me to join ACES. Luiza had at the time recently written an article trying to make sense of anti-lockdown protests, the seemingly unusual spectacle of the convergence between the right and the left, for example, in Germany's Querdenken movement. As a media studies researcher myself, I had encountered this on YouTube and Instagram, where, for example, wellness influencers seemingly were converging with conspiracy theorists. In trying to make sense of this, a colleague reminded me of Mitchell's work on state phobia. His book, Statephobia and Civil Society, the title from his 2016 book, co-written with Casper Villadsen, wherein Mitchell and Casper explore the political legacy of Michel Foucault. This term, state phobia, comes from a lecture that Foucault gave in early 1979, when he discussed and critiqued the idea of the despotic state, kind of slippery slope between bureaucratic regulation leading to fascism, a fascist state. In his time, the idea was connected to the ultra-left, of which he had been a part, but also with the radical conservative neoliberal movement with which he was intrigued. In 2016, Mitchell discussed these themes with Daniel Zamora at an event at the University of Amsterdam, an event which I attended, and which, it turns out, became the starting point for his newest book, entitled The Last Man Takes LSD, Foucault and the End of Revolution. So, as it turns out, after taking LSD in California, there is a break in Foucault's thought, after which the desire for revolution becomes a problem to be overcome, in Foucault's words, in a dialogue that he had with Pierre-Henri Lévy, Bernard-Henri Lévy. So he looked to events in his own time and to antiquity for answers to this problem, to the anti-totalitarian left, to neoliberalism, to the Iranian Revolution, to S&M, and antiquity. So it would be interesting, if anachronistic, to wonder how Foucault would position himself in this current moment. But perhaps we'll get to that. So we'll start with Luiza and Mitchell discussing between the two of them, after which we'll open up things to the audience for questions, which you can submit via the chat. Now I would like to just very briefly introduce the two speakers. Mitchell Dean is a professor of public governance at the Copenhagen Business School, where he has held that position since 2012, and is the author of many articles and books, including the classic Governmentality, Power, and Rule in Modern Society. Luiza Bialasiewicz is the professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam and the academic co-director of ACES, and a political geographer currently working on the contentious politics of the pandemic, including politics of vaccines and anti-lockdown protests. Luiza and Mitchell, may I please now pass the baton to you?
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Welcome everybody also on behalf of ACES. And Mitchell, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I have to say very selfishly, I'm very happy that you can help us, we hope, make sense of some of this at least. And from your own perspective as well as from Foucault's, since he has been called into question already. So we thought we would run this as a kind of open conversation, and that's what we would like to do in this first part of the webinar. So the first question that I'd like to ask you has to do very much with the title of this series, of this webinar, and that has to do with state phobia, because I'm very troubled by that term, not just by the term itself, but more even with, how do we put the state into understanding what these protests are, what sort of claims making is taking place, and who is also doing that claims making, because as Mark already indicated in his introduction, we've seen a great variety of anti-lockdown protests, or all sorts of protests against health measures, including against vaccinations. But I think we have to be very careful to understand, how different they have been from context to context, and also, kind of unpack that. And hopefully we can do that. But they have all, at least very frequently, been packaged under the rubric of anti-state protests, both by commentators and myself included, but also by the way in which the media has been presented. Whether it is the Querdenken movement that Mark already mentioned in Germany, in Austria, the various movements in the Netherlands, the original virus madness movement and subsequent ones, in Italy, the Gilet Arancioni, and so on, which are, again, quite different also in intensity from country to country. And I guess the thing that has troubled me about this sort of presentation is, are these really, in fact, anti-state protests? And what are the dangers of such a framing? Because, presenting them as protests against the state already necessarily frames them as anti-institutional, potentially anti-democratic, and in a sense immediately pushes the protests and the protesters into the realm of the far right, for example, and neglects, some of the very real economic claims, the class dimension, and so on. So I think, to my mind, kind of understanding what do we mean by the state and what sort of state are we talking about is really relevant. But I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Luiza, and thanks to Mark for his lovely introduction. And thank you for being in this webinar with us. I think if we started with the one notion that might be a way of thinking about this question of the state and what kind of state we're talking about, to me, it would go back to the kind of genealogy of the welfare state and the emergence by the mid-20th century, and I suppose often in a kind of social compact after the Second World War, of a kind of highly articulated set of policies and institutions designed to secure the conditions under which citizens would live, to manage risk, to manage risks of unemployment, of ill health, and which was central to the development of a public health system. So it seems to me that, I don't know whether this is my age or generation showing, but there is a kind of moment at which probably, let's say the 1960s, where social conflict, class conflict has been in some way managed within the context of or mediated within the context of the welfare state, and the idea of a kind of social government has crystallized. And it's precisely the same moment, I suppose, that we see the emergence of not as a result of one set of ways of thinking or one ideology or one philosophy, although neoliberalism is clearly beginning to emerge at this time. But we see a whole range of what I would think of as kind of anti-movements or or gestures which criticize somehow the settlement that's been achieved. And so one of the ways in which I would place Foucault, for example, is someone who was very much anti-welfare state. He's anti the expertise which comes to be embedded in the welfare state. He's anti the way that creates subjects. He calls that subjectification, the disciplinary nature of it. But there are other movements as well that are, and other thinkers who are maybe relying on Max Weber and his image of the iron cage in order to criticize bureaucracy. So whereas Weber himself probably thought that bureaucracy was the most efficient way of organizing large-scale organizations with some downsides. By the 60s, this style of thought had seized upon this idea of the iron cage of bureaucracy and this idea that we were kind of caught within it. A little bit later, I think we get, as we get towards the fragility, I suppose, of the alternative to the kind of Western capitalist welfare state, we get the emergence of, with Solzhenitsyn, the dissidents from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, we get this kind of anti-totalitarian movement. And that kind of becomes another layer that, well, okay, where one of the questions would be, okay, well, what's so good about replacing the capitalist with the state bureaucrat? That aren't we going to have less freedom under those kind of conditions? So this, if you like, this kind of, there's a strange and much more complex kind of genealogy that I'm giving that I think questions the idea of professional expertise as it is embodied within the forms of organization, public and private, of the state and of the welfare state, that lives in fear of the slippery slope between bureaucratic forms of organization, experts, the authority of experts, the way in which they subjectify, as Foucault would put it, and a slippery slope towards a kind of totalitarianism. And these, I don't know, let's say movements, factions, groups appear on the left and the right. And on the right, I suppose, it takes the form of, from the late 70s onwards, the entry from outside the acknowledged political discourse of neoliberalism, something that had been brewing in a way since the Second World War, and the first movements of privatization, undermining the welfare state, rolling back the welfare state. This kind of first Reagan Thatcher moment, at least in the sort of Anglo-Saxon world. But on the other hand, the left itself was in this moment of kind of losing confidence in its own achievements, losing confidence in its own organizations, its own formal organizations, trade unions, political parties, and so on, and searching for some other way of governing than this bureaucratic, formal political way. And in the book, the recent book on Foucault, we call this the search for a left governmentality. And the search for a left governmentality is often about drawing upon American neoliberal ideas and using them and trying to understand whether they can be used to reposition the left. And then if you, I know I'm going, my story is going on a little bit long in a way. But the next moment of that particular conjunction would be the 1990s, where you get the re-emergence of this new left in France, the second left, the third way in the UK. You get that takes over the old social democratic and socialist parties, and a new form of politics emerges, or at least it presents itself as a new form of politics, which is very much a kind of compromise with this neoliberal agenda, and which in my own view is much more effective in the rolling out of that agenda, in the phase of the development of the normalization within the techniques of governing of this kind of privatization, marketization, competition, notions of entrepreneurship, and so on. And so this to me is the background, I guess, by which we think about contemporary, well, whether we call it state phobia, but contemporary anti-statism, because alongside, I suppose, these left movements from this same period, say from the 90s, we have a whole host of ways of thinking about self-management. Self-management is better than formal organization, that it's related to some idea of democracy, civil society, the idea that there's a vitality and creativity and innovation that exists outside of the state, and the state is simply this rigid framework that's going to stifle that. And there's no so I think someone like Zygmunt Bauman must have written about 6 or 7 books with the word fluid in the title. Fluidity, movement, creativity, these innovation. And one can see the kind of overlaps between the kind of neoliberal agenda and this, shall we say, social movement kind of agenda, or civil society. And even in both your case and my case, we're both professors of governance. We're not state theorists or professors of the state or something like that. We both have governance in the title, because at this particular point of time, somehow governance became a kind of keyword that suggested we weren't going to have all of that nasty hierarchical authoritarian sovereignty anymore. We were going to have some kind of fluid networking set of connections, and that's how we were going to arrange things, whether it's in Europe or European multi-level governance, whether it's connecting with civil society organizations, private organizations, and so on. So this undermining of the kind of the public sphere, this kind of long-term undermining of the public sphere, I think is at the core of this.
And, you know, and it's very interesting that you say that, because these connotations that have attached to the state, you know, whether as, you know, hierarchical, necessarily oppressive, stifling, not just of creativity, but also of politics. So politics is something that happens amongst social movements, or just movements in general, where the state, you know, solidifies, stifles. I mean, if we think, you know, of Roberto Esposito's work, you know, it's the kind of the immunological state. And, you know, and it's interesting that he has also kind of moved away as Agamben has shifted to my mind, quite problematic positions, you know, attacking the role of the state in the pandemic. Esposito has taken a very different stance, saying, no, we actually need to bring the state back in, bring institutions back in, just in a different form. But I think, you know, kind of coming back, and I think this genealogy was really, really helpful. I mean, very helpful to me, but you know, hopefully very helpful to our audience as well, in thinking how we got where we are today, because calling the state back in, as became necessary during the pandemic, or, you know, seemingly, because, you know, it's not that the state ever went away. I mean, we talk about, you know, this extension of state powers, you know, new forms of bodily control, new forms of mobility control. Those capacities were always there. It's just that, you know, most of us, fortunate enough to have the right kind of passport, did not experience them. But the state maintained its ability to control mobility, to contain, to confine, and all of that. So this, kind of surprise, this return of state sovereignty, I found surprising some of that language, as did anybody who works on migration, certainly. But I think, the other shift that you identify, and that to me is also, kind of fascinating, is as, this understanding of not just the welfare state, but the state itself shifts over these decades, so does the locus both of rights and responsibilities. So you're already talking about, this idea of, the independent, responsible self that is very much, and you rightly note, not just pushed, by a kind of neoliberalizing agenda, but actually by the left. Including by the ecological left, by the wellness industry that Mark already mentioned. And so perhaps we should find entirely unsurprising, these bedfellows in the protests. So, kind of the green ecological left together with the right in claiming that, it is individual rights and individual responsibilities that should take center stage, including in the realm of health. Because how then, if this is the case, do you govern a pandemic, which is a public health emergency? How do you bring the public back in when the claims are being made to individual rights and responsibilities, as are certainly being made by some of these movements? How do you respond to that? What sort of state are you bringing back in, apart from, emergency measures, which is exactly what has been happening?
No, it's an interesting. One of the things that we point out in the recent book is that there's a sense in which this kind of progressive thinking gave up on the idea of power relations, structures, and so on, and actually made the argument, inspired by Eastern philosophy, inspired by ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, that the subject and the subjectivity was going to become, or had become, the main focus of politics. That politics was now about everyday life. The personal was political. So this was the kind of genesis, I think, of this idea that there is a kind of, as you said, that real politics occurs outside of formal organization and political parties and the kind of struggles that you get around, I suppose, interest struggles around the state. And in that sense, I would sort of think about the kind of history by which suddenly things like class relations were thought to dissolve completely in the face of it. We could choose our own, not only our gender identity, not only our sexuality, but class itself became an identity, and we could choose to overcome it. We don't want to be defined by it anymore. Therefore, we don't need to identify with the same kinds of political parties that our parents identified with. We are engaged in a different kind of politics. So I think this movement to subjectivity is one aspect, but also the kind of sense of all the themes around neoliberal entrepreneurship, the idea that radical thinking was now going to be about social entrepreneurship, that one had to make one's life into a kind of, as Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, said in the 90s, one's life should become a planning project, a kind of reflexive project by which you could question all of these social determinations in which you find yourself and somehow transcend it and become a cosmopolitan being. And I think that these ideas, I guess, are not simply the ideas of intellectuals or kind of ideological movements, but they definitely became ideas that were embedded in our universities, in our education. These were very successful social intellectual movements in that sense.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, I think one of the striking things, beginning to look at some of these protests, and especially the protests contesting health measures and anti-vaccine movements, and there's various dimensions, also geopolitical there. But reading some of the literature, I mean, that is very much there, especially on the kind of ecological left. So, this idea of your health as your own responsibility, where you are, really this active planning, as you're saying, I mean, in Beck's terms, subject. But, where class is just kind of, pushed aside entirely. But there's a very interesting, kind of work that happens there, because certainly a lot of the kind of ethnographic work that has been done, people who are very active, certainly in, in North America in these communities, this is before the pandemic, see themselves as enlightened and active subjects who are able to make these choices, who are able not to follow the dictates of the state, for example, to vaccinate their children, because they know better. Why do they know better? Because of their particular position as educated, as able to, buy organic food. I mean, there's a whole construction of the self that goes on that says, I am able to make these choices because I am in the position to do that. I mean, there were these wonderful anecdotes, told by researchers with, mothers being interviewed in California, who had refused vaccination for their children, saying, well, but, for other people, maybe in poorer communities, they don't have this possibility. So the state should vaccinate their kids. So it's, in terms of individuation and actually assuming a very particular class identity and position, that was there. But that's, kind of brings us to the present moment. And the thing that was striking to me is that even states themselves, including the most recent actions of the European Commission in pushing forward the vaccination certificates, or now they're going to be called something else. They're the digital green certificates that will be both vaccination certificates and something else, focus entirely on the individual. The idea is that this is something that you vaccinate, it's a contract between you and the state, and then you get certain possibilities attached to it. So you're not, vaccinating for public good and for the well-being of the population. Really thinking biopolitical terms, but it's really a contractual individual arrangement recognized, by the freedom to travel in this case, or the ability to access certain spaces. So even, those trying to still play welfare state or still play, the kind of the active, if not activist state, are already speaking this language and already slipping into that understanding.
So it's a contract so I think that that's a very good point, because we have been talking previously about what would Foucault think about the nature of these passports, and in a way, thinking of them as calling them a biopolitical passport, for COVID passport as a biopolitical passport, doesn't really get us anywhere, I don't think. And it's just a description. And there's definitely, as you say, there's definitely this kind of individualization and contractualization, which in a way parallels the kind of techniques that have been brought in to governing the unemployed and that kind of stuff as well, because they're all about transaction between, well, we'll support you if you do certain things and if you exercise your freedom in a certain way. So there's almost a classical liberal, what I would call governmental relation that's being established there. But on the other hand, and what I would point out before we get too excited about the possibility that there's actually a kind of nudging or governing through freedom or something that's associated with these passports, is that they are actually dividing populations, dividing spaces, providing degrees of access to space, possibilities of movement for certain populations and not for others. And it was always the case that it seems to me that the downside of this kind of individualization is that it ends up as a kind of province, a kind of those who see themselves in the kind of as morally superior, those who have managed themselves in a particular way, and that they can then look down on those who haven't managed their careers and are not able to properly look after their children, or whatever it happens to be. And so there's a kind of division already there, and this kind of re-emergence of this kind of division. And this certainly, as you also say, within this contract, however, in a way, liberal the kind of exchange of responsibility and benefit that you get from it, there is very much the sovereign that's involved in this. Making, they only work if they're authorized, if there are checkpoints at which the sovereign state reappears, and which stops people, prevents people going in certain spaces or doing certain things, which can be policed more or less heavy-handedly.
Well, and I think, and I'm very glad that you say that, because I think, that is the thing. So, I mean, you're playing kind of on two registers, actually on multiple registers, where on the, one hand, there's this attempt, whether by the Commission or national governments, whether the Italian or the Danish one that's issuing its own national certificates, of saying, this is a contractual arrangement. You want to travel. I mean, nobody's obliging you to travel, apart from the fact that, as European citizens, we have the right to free movement within the Union that has been suspended. But presenting it as a contractual arrangement assumes, yes, one, equal access, which of course is not the case, because we do not all have equal access to vaccination right now. Even the fact that, if it's not vaccination, it's testing, which is quite expensive. I mean, up to 150 euros in some cases. So that already constricts, the possibility of free movement. But it presumes equal subjects, who of course are profoundly unequal. I mean, and so, kind of delimiting in this case, mobility, but even, entry into that category, I think is something that we need to be very aware of. And as you said, I mean, sovereign power has not disappeared at all. Actually, it's very active. And, I think one of the many critiques that have been made against this, these new tools is that they will in fact become, kind of general purpose infrastructure, as colleagues, who study, kind of these things would term them, that will remain as, very much a kind of a tool for biopolitical monitoring, having a specific health identity attached, to you as, as a form of your identification. So now this becomes the kind of passportization of health. The other problem there is that these are private companies that are also managing these tools. I mean, I know both in the case of France and Italy, it's the same companies who developed the tracking app that are now being called in to provide, these new passes. But I think, this is, as you're saying, a kind of a wider problem that, removes the idea of, whether public health or, any sort of collectivity from the discussion. And I think I would agree with you. It also moralizes very much, the individual's concerned. So if you, made the right choices.
So one thing worries me about our discussion at the moment, though, is that I think we're heading onto that easy opposition between, where we're starting to talk about the sovereign. I'm the one who's raised it, but we're starting to talk about the sovereignty as something that's always repressive, and that and it's repressive of these newfound forms of subjectivity and individuality and self-responsibility and so on. And that's where I think we can place a lot of the kind of opposition on this kind of axis, if you like, between authoritarian overreach that's going to be articulated through social media and apps and so on, and individual freedoms. And that's where a lot of the opposition, particularly I think the German ones, seem to be much more in this kind of, the Querdenker ones seem to be much more in this along this kind of range of tensions, if you like. But I would also want to place the whole COVID issue and the management of COVID in a different, back on a different one, which is the one that I began with, in a sense, with talking about the social and the welfare state and the development of public health, and the idea that if one person is sick, then we're all sick in some way, and that we have to manage, and the gradual, which is undermining of that by contractualization, which we're talking about as well. This is private companies. The undermining of that, because it's no longer about everyone having an equal right. Certainly, Queen Elizabeth and Rupert Murdoch have had their vaccines a long time ago. Nobody's got, we don't have it. There's no idea of an equal access to any of this. That there's this whole kind of sets of differentiation by age, by particular occupational groups, and they vary from country to country, how that's going to occur. So there's so in this sense, we've got, what I want to also emphasize is that I think the history of the development of public health, and this is something Esposito is also starting to link into the development of the institutions of public health, and that the first reaction to the virus was the isolation, the testing, the tracing. These are all classic public health forms of practices and knowledge, and those places with better infrastructures were ones that, in public health, that remaining infrastructures that had survived this period of privatization and so on, and the restriction of the health services, and were ones that could cope much better with it. And the fact that we now have to vaccinate everybody, well, that's really a failure of the public health system. It's a failure of our ability to deal with this with the public health institutions. So in that sense, I think that a far more profound way of thinking about the conflict is really between this emergent, let's call it neoliberal way of governing, and the older infrastructures left of the public health system and the welfare state. And there's multiple kind of ramifications we can go into about that.
No, and absolutely, and I think you're right. And one of the things I think that's been really troubling me is, how do you give those infrastructures and those institutions new meaning that is not only repressive, that is not only, and I think that has been very much Esposito's concern, saying, these measures, how do you make citizens understand that, there is a kind of a collective good, whether it's, public health, or, how do you go beyond explaining, the need to do certain things in contractual terms. And that's why, I was using the example of the passport, because I'm very troubled by that it becomes a kind of contractual arrangement, rather than thinking of, whether you want to, use the term the commons, or a public set of, capacities, but also responsibilities. And I think that's the very difficult thing, because then that would also, I think, allow you to respond differently to some of the protests against the lockdowns that have very legitimate, certainly economic claims, that don't then become, just sucked into some of the fringes of these movements.
Well, I think the one context that I think I've got beginning to get some kind of grip on, although these are it's very difficult to do so, is the Italian one. And it seems to me that, Italy's been through 30 years of kind of austerity, that of political chaos, the kind of collapse after Tangentopoli of the old political parties, Berlusconi, Renzi, and so on. And then that with the kind of Ryanair, cheap flights of the night, in this century, the whole kind of development of industries, in the food industry, of the home sharing industry, or whatever we call that, developed. And this actually lifted a lot of people who had been kind of pushed out of the labor market by the collapse of the state, by fiscal austerity and so on, often as a result of EU policies. It allowed them to get back into some kind of living, and that at least a part of the people who are protesting, who see this as who are out there protesting in Naples and so on, and are people who've been forced to either back into unemployment or to join the riders, as they call them, the Uber riders, who seem to be, there's swarms of them everywhere in Naples. And then on the other hand, you have the other constituency that seems to be something like the small boutique owners, the shopkeepers, the restaurateurs, and so on, who are probably not compliant with the state. Their businesses their businesses are ones that rely on the fact that that there's a black economy, that they're outside the tax system and so on, so that they don't want the state to come in and support them at the moment in which they're being closed, because they don't want to open the books, possibly because they're, they don't want to reveal how they've been actually surviving. And so that particular segment seems to me to be very much open to the Giorgio Agamben kind of line, which is, that this is just more state of exception. It's like the war on terror. It's overreached by the state. And they couldn't really get a kind of articulated voice around supporting people who were affected by closing, because those people didn't want to be supported by the state in that sense.
It's really interesting. I had a very good analysis made to me this morning from my vegetable seller, who I've been trying to place politically. So this is in a kind of working class neighborhood in Rome. And yesterday there was, one of the many protests that have taken place, this time they're called the ambulanti. So people who have stands, whether vegetable stands, or selling tourists, used to be selling trinkets in the center, clothes, whatever it is. And they literally blocked the city. They also blocked the major highways going into the city. And, of course, there were scuffles with the police. Of course, the far right appeared as well. And, with all sorts of slogans, chants, throwing things. And so what Maurizio, the vegetable seller, told me, he said, you know what, this is all that is left to us. You just have to, make these extreme acts because there's really nobody who will speak for us. And he said, in the years of Berlinguer, the then head of the Communist Party, we knew what we could ask for.
Yes. Yeah.
And, and I thought in that kind of 5-minute interchange as I was getting my artichokes, he said, the parties have disappeared. There is there's nobody to speak for us. We are now all individual subjects. We're all, as he said, categories now. And every category, picks a day to go protest. These protests are then very frequently also, kind of sucked up by usually the right, at least in the Italian context. Attached to them, those protesting the measures for other reasons. But this idea of having any sort of, representation of your economic interests, there's nobody, as he said, there's nobody to speak for us. We have to block the highways now.
Yes. So it's I think it's important to try to do, and a part of it is the way in which we academics, in a way, have abandoned the notion of class. And we don't do a class analysis. It's only recently people starting to do class analysis anymore. And it's important not just to dismiss these people as people who have had their minds corrupted by conspiracy theories and things like that. That there are kind of real material conditions under which people are facing choices and which lead them. Of course you want to open the restaurants and get, if you're a waiter, and get your job back. So this, in a place, if we contrast it with somewhere like Denmark, which is in many ways, I don't want to make it out to be a utopia, and I think as a migrant, it isn't a utopia in the least. But there is a high level, there's a relatively homogenous population, high level of trust in government, high level of compliance with the tax system. In fact, people support the tax system. These are central functions of the state, the ability to levy and gather taxes. That's a condition for the kind of life in which we live, right? It's a condition for the public health systems and so on. And that's a very, there's quite low levels, I would say, of kind of protests that occur here. And the second point I just wanted to make about protest was that one of the things that I find very interesting about any of the kind of videos and protests, that you see, is that migrants don't appear in these protests, because migrants and people are used to complying. They're used to filling in forms. They're used to acting responsibly in order to maintain their residency within. The Querdenker ones, they seem to be often very affluent people who want to return to normality.
That's very much the case. And it's really interesting. There have been protests by migrant agricultural laborers, not just in Italy, also in Spain. But these are already people, who have, for the most part, some regular contracts, because they were, some of the first victims of the pandemic, where, they, in complete violation of all the border closures, agricultural laborers were being flown across state borders to pick, asparagus in Austria and Netherlands, strawberries, take your pick. But I want to come back to the point about conspiracy theories and bring Mark into our conversation, since he's been doing a lot of work, actually empirical work on these questions. Because I think what you said is very important. And this is something that has been troubling me as well in looking at these protests, is, not simply, kind of discounting them and those participating as, kind of completely mad, in, believing some of these theories, because of course they are ways of making sense of a world that has, lost many bearings, political, economic, and, many of these theories offer very neat, very coherent representations of what is going on. So identifying the good guys and the bad guys, those who are to blame for the spread of COVID, for, whatever is wrong with the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, also, to better understand what is happening, I think, we need to find a way, not maybe necessarily to speaking, I've had this long running conversation with colleagues who study the far right about, how do you talk to conspiracists? If that's even possible. And I've become convinced that if somebody is very set in their beliefs, I've tried it with taxi drivers, with others who've shared their ideas with me, but also in interviews. But how do we take those ideas seriously and think about what a response, even a state response, should be? So, Mark, I'd love for you to jump in, because you have been looking at a lot of this. Also in the current context, and kind of whether various negationist ideas, anti-vaccination movements, and so on.
Yeah, that's true. I have been doing research together with some colleagues. We have a project called infodemic.eu. And so there's quite a bit of that research there. It's very interesting research. It's something that I've been involved in for a few years. In fact, it was the context in which I initially met Mitchell when I first got involved in doing that type of research, tracing the origins of the Pizzagate conspiracy from the bottom of the web on a website called 4chan, which then subsequently mutated into QAnon and then spread into the White House, or at least into the Capitol building. It is studying conspiracy theory is difficult and challenging, and often leaves me feeling quite conflicted, because it is there are very tricky epistemological questions that are almost impossible to resolve. It's very difficult to study conspiracy theories because it's very difficult to say what in fact is a conspiracy theory. Certainly with quantitative techniques, it's practically impossible. But I have, for example, I did do some research where I went and read all of the conspiracy theory books that I could find being sold on Amazon relating to COVID-19. I bought them and I read through them to sort of verify that I felt that this was in fact conspiracy theory. And amazingly, it was, what we found was that when you searched for COVID, if you were to treat Amazon, I'm not sure that anybody does, but if you were a sort of a naive user and you treated Amazon as the place where you would look for like authoritative information on the issue, then what was served to you through Amazon's algorithmic categorization system was certainly COVID skeptical. Books like Unreported Truth and a bestseller in Germany called COVID False Alarm that present a very peculiar version of COVID, but also really central in that was just unquestioned conspiracy theory books. And that was quite something. These books were recommended to you. They were sometimes offered bundled with other books. So if you were, you're looking for a book on, I don't know, alternative health, and they say, well, why don't you buy this strange book by David Icke while you're at it? So they were making money off of it too. So that was interesting. And the other platforms, they were a bit of an outlier, Amazon was, in relation to this issue. The other platforms were more active in terms of policing this kind of stuff. But that also, to me, that's also, there are issues with that, and that maybe is where I would maybe come back to you guys with a question about this. Because I wonder sometimes if we can't understand these protests to use a sort of a humanities method of symptomatic analysis, if we can't understand them symptomatically as protests against a kind of a incredible centralization of power between a kind of a triumph in this moment in time. This is like a triumvirate of the state, corporations, and intergovernmental organizations that all really got on board together to, for the greater good, but nevertheless in an enormous centralization of power. And the point that I think is, in looking at conspiracy theories, it's helpful also in looking at extremism to try to understand the perceived kernel of truth at the core of these ideologies, that they are kind of coherent in their own way internally. And so, like, for example, one of the people who kept on coming up, and there's a many different, like, what you could call conspiracy theories, and they're very scattered, but who kept one figure that kept on popping up across the spectrum was Bill Gates. And, Bill Gates is a conspiracist. He was like held accountable by the United States government in 1998 of conspiracy. He had a conspiracy it's an antitrust conspiracy, but it is a conspiracy. And he was certainly, so there are legitimate, in other words, elements inside many of these things. And it's quite easy to imagine that there are kind of absolute, there's kind of mania that's running loose, but there are taxi drivers and stuff that we encounter who will present bizarre accounts of things, but there are also kind of often quite legitimate elements in there, and how exactly to separate them out and what to call a conspiracy, I have found very difficult in the empirical research that I've done as well. As much as I certainly believe that it's important and want to hold these platforms accountable for facilitating the circulation of these kinds of things.
I can, I'm just recalling our previous interaction. I can sort of give, I don't know that I can answer your question, but I could also maybe think about the question of truth and the question of political truth, and say, it seems to me that maybe, you spoke about a kernel of truth, maybe there are different modes of producing truth, that a kind of one of the modes of producing truth that's been really dominant, and which somehow matches up with that kind of welfare post-war world, was a kind of very stable public sphere truth of the mass media and so on. And in a place like Denmark, in fact, it still exists. Everyone still gets their news from the same, the same public broadcaster, and that's very much a kind of cohesive kind of system. But that and as you were pointing out in the Pizzagate paper, with these kind of very weird online forums and so on, there's algorithmically, you can produce a truth. It's maybe not the conspiracy theory that the Democrats were running pedophiles out of a Washington pizza place, right? Just with little indications that can be assembled in particular ways. Well, it's a kind of it's an assemblage of truth. And the other thing that I think, that when we're looking at the movements, and I haven't looked at them closely enough because I've actually been more sort of looking at Black Lives Matters type movements and so on, this kind of American identity politics, is that the way these gatherings of people are also systems of the production of truth. And whether it's through what I've called acclamation, whether it's through the public speech and gestures and so on in terms of particular policies or particular leaders or against them, but there a lot of these kind of social movements that we see are actually enacting almost quasi-religious rituals of the production of truth, confession, expunging your sins, whether it's racism or whatever, dealing with the enemy within publicly. So in this sense, I think rather than, I think conspiracy theory remains a good category in some ways, but it might be interesting to think about different modes of the production of truth in different political contexts. It's not an answer, but
sorry, but so the only thing I think that I would add to it is, I think taking these stories about the world seriously, because that's what they are. They are, they are very much forms of very powerful storytelling that are mobilizing people also out into the streets, and in some places in large numbers. I think that's very important. I think, what I would add to this, and maybe this is my own professional deformation as a political geographer, is the geopolitical element. Because both the German and the Dutch anti-lockdown protests have been fed by disinformation from Russia, but not only. This has been documented. So, thinking of, the remnants of hard power now exercised differently, those are still there. We may be, thinking we're playing with our own truths. We as the protesters, and making appeals, to individual sovereignty, individual rights. But those decisions and those claims that you're making are also being shaped by very powerful international actors. And I think, if I were to try to make some sort of intervention, and actually people are calling for that. Certainly in the US context, it's really interesting how the Tea Party begins to get close to the anti-vax movement. And bring in health into the kind of the broader set of kind of identity politics that the Republican Party begins to be interested in. And by now, you know, they've been fused. I mean, if you look at vaccination attitudes in the United States right now, I mean, they're clearly split along party lines. I mean, it's amazing. You know, a friend was telling me, you know, when it was still difficult to get vaccines, he was looking at the electoral turnout and looking, you know, saying, I'm just going to drive to the nearest Republican district because they'll have, you know, vaccines left over. And it was not a, you know, mistaken call. But, you know, how on earth has, you know, I mean, anti-scientism become such a formidable part of, you know, the Republican platform in the United States, and how, you know, it has been sucked up into, you know, European politics of various sorts as well. And I mean, I'm thinking back, Mitchell, to what you were saying about the dismantling of expertise, which was also very much part of the post-war welfare state, or just, you know, I mean, the very idea of the state. I mean, that has also gone. I don't know, Mark, if this, you know, in part responds. I mean, so I think, you know, I think I'm partially, you know, only partially in agreement with you, you know, to kind of to think about, you know, kind of the validity of, you know, or equal validity of certainly claims making with respect to public health.
Maybe I can give another example very briefly as we wait for some more questions to come in as well from the audience. Mitchell, in your book, at one point, in your recent book, at one point, I recall you were talking about a period of when critical theory was kind of at a low ebb, but there was Hart and Negri's Empire that came out, which in that period, that I recall that very well. In that book there was, and other books of that genre, there was a very clearly articulated critique of intergovernmental neoliberal organizations like the World Economic Forum and so forth. So the World Economic Forum just had their 50th annual meeting the other day, and they called it was themed on COVID, and it was called the Great Reset. And it's somebody like Steve Bannon shares actually something a little bit along the lines of the critique of Hart and Negri when talking about the Davos class. So there's a way in which elements of the populist right have integrated those critiques from the far left and really made hay with them and achieved some remarkable feats of political organization. And so what is interesting about this particular event is when you go onto the website for the YouTube video where they announce this, or when you go onto the Amazon page for the book that was published by the head of the World Economic Forum, and you scroll down into the comments, or the reviews as they call them on Amazon, you see in amongst the reviews some left-wing critiques of, you know, kind of a neoliberal conspiracy of the elite. But what you see as much, if not more, is what I would call conspiracy theory, it really shades pretty quickly into like the full-on version of conspiracy theory. And so I guess my question would be something about how to sort of preserve that kind of tradition of radical critique in this era of conspiracy theorizing and also deplatforming as well. Because I think that one of the reasons, in fact, that people have, in this case, have it possibly moved to these sites, these that I just described, is because they've been sort of deplatformed from being able to participate in their other conspiracies. There's a lot of deplatforming, by the way, that's happened recently to a great many of these communities. So yeah, my question is something like that, about the sort of how to preserve radical critique, how to sort of take it back in the midst of all of this conversation about problematic critique or conspiracy theory, just to sort of finish that topic before we move on to another.
It's not a question I can answer easily. I'm afraid it's a good question. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think definitely there's sort of there has to be some rebuilding a political organization and some kind of reinvestment in political organizations that are going to address, the question that are going to address questions of inequality, of environment, and so on towards the state. Without that, then this kind of free-floating kind of sets of relations that you talk about, and where people can be picked up by, I mean, if the only people that are really there articulating these grievances are right-wing conspiracy theory parties and so on, well, then you hook into them. I mean, one of the thoughts I've got, I suppose, is that maybe we should abandon this kind of critique of populism. That the idea of populism is another problematic kind of concept, ill-defined concept that disables kind of critical thought, and that then all of those who fall outside, well, a vanishing middle, are considered to be populist, and then the project becomes the kind of reconstruction of this kind of liberal middle or something like that. I think that we have to take, populists more, well, people are taking them more seriously, but and in that sense, anti-populism is a kind of fits into my genealogy of anti-totalitarianism, anti-statism, and so on, as the kind of latest kind of recuperative mechanism.
You know what, I think you're absolutely right, because I mean, I think, that just reproduces this kind of entirely false dichotomy between, the state and the state institutions, and then politics outside. And then, I mean, if that's, populists are all those that somehow don't fit the, the institutions or contest those institutions. But I think it also, as you're saying, consigns this critique, whether it is of, corporate capital, big pharma, big tech, take your pick, or, all of them together, only within these channels, because there is, no, alternative response, certainly from the left, that would incorporate a kind of also institutional, also public. And maybe I like public somehow better than, actually, I know I do like public much better than institutional as a term. That really reclaims, I think, the notion of the public. And of course, there are movements that are doing that. I mean, we've mentioned already, the notion of all the movements that are talking to the idea of the commons as well, and practices of commoning. But that still is lacking. It still kind of positions itself outside of the state, which I think is an issue. But I mean, Mark, I think it's to me, I mean, it's not just, let's say, a research task. I think it's a very important political task to find a way to speaking to that, because, otherwise it really, I mean, we are tracing that dividing line between, kind of elites, those who know, and then, the conspiracy believers, which is, kind of the unwashed populist masses. I mean, it's the same thing in terms of, the division that's being traced here.
I have actually a question for you, Luiza, but also possibly for Mitchell. Departing from your concept of your idea of personal sovereignty as a kind of your critique of this sort of neoliberal type subjectivity opposed to the greater good and cuts across the right and the left in your analysis of these movements that we've been talking about. And I understand how personal sovereignty has a class dimension, a kind of something like spiritual privilege, a term that I've heard used in a critique of New Age. But it's also arguably at the core of this idea of, I would like to suggest that maybe it's at the core of the idea of self-care in Foucault's later work. And so my question then is, isn't it more a matter of a kind of a really paranoid, extreme preoccupation with personal sovereignty than an issue with personal sovereignty as such?
I mean, this is a term, and this was a piece that actually 2 pieces, one that I co-wrote with my colleague, Hannah Mühlenhoff, on open democracy, and then another piece that I co-wrote with another colleague who is a lawyer, Christina Eckes, that we wrote for political geography, thinking about these terms, individual sovereignty, personal sovereignty, that are being used by these movements, which have no basis in law. I mean, and even the appeals that Querdenken or other movements have made, that they have made in Germany and in Austria, based on these, individualized rights, which don't actually exist. In liberal democratic states, rights are conferred by the state. They are not individual, and this attempt at individualizing them also in claims making, is problematic if only from a legal point of view. But to go back to your point of, this kind of extreme personalization almost, it becomes immediately a problem. One, because it's profoundly unequal. Your possibility to, both exact and exert that sort of extreme self-care is based on privilege. Those who can not, for example, expose themselves because they're not transport workers or supermarket clerks. Those who, at least in their imagination, can protect themselves by eating organic food and, engaging in other practices that they believe will protect them and, boost their immune system. Those are forms of privilege. And I think those people would disagree with me. I know, I've had various arguments with friends and colleagues about this when, I tell them that's a very classist assumption. Also because with their actions, they're actively endangering others who are vulnerable and may not, agree. But, I think to me, then the question becomes, how do you respond to that? Short of disciplinary measures, short of the state saying, no, you will get vaccinated, no, you will be locked down. How do you engage citizens in the project of even governing the pandemic? And explain that, this is about a collectivity. This is something that, that troubles me. And has been troubling me for a year now, and I'm sure not just me.
I think the whole discourse of sovereignty is interesting, isn't it? Because it's both political and it's both about political institutions, and at one level it's the kind of institution of institutions that that's what sovereignty is. It's what is the foundation of all the other institutions, and then we talk about personal sovereignty. And there's a kind of interaction. This is the kind of authoritarian overreach versus individual liberty axis, isn't it? Personal sovereignty. And in democracy, the state, the institution, the state sovereignty is supposed to be made up of all the actions of the individual sovereigns. So you're kind of stuck within a particular framework when you're thinking in terms of sovereignty, and even describing yourself in terms of sovereignty. So I think that's interesting, and that's probably one step beyond Foucault's self-care idea. And I notice that these movements do often refer to the constitution, the German constitution, and before they're going to be rendered illegal under constitutional arrangements as well. But they refer to the Constitution. The Italian ones refer to articles of the Constitution talking about their inalienable rights and so on. So that is an element of that kind of discussion, which is actually away from the technologies of the self and caring for the self and governing others. And it's really stuck in a very powerful and very old, in some sense, political discourse of sovereignty. That's it's fascinating in that.
It is fascinating because they are very much, as you're saying, using both the language and the actual even attributes very often of the state, to make these contestations. Whether in the Italian context or the German one.
And that speaks to your point about not being not overdoing this anti-statist theme. Because I even noticed in the latest online post of Agamben, he talks about imprescribable rights and inalienable rights. He, after years of critiquing sovereignty and critiquing law, somehow emerges in the kind of in his critique of the medicalization, which is everybody has become what he calls the asymptomatic individual, and therefore suspicious and subject to all this kind of regulation. And that what has been forgotten is this older citizen. Well, I didn't think you ever really seriously believed in it, did you, man? And they're kind of reinventing that language as well, in someone who's in a way been kind of opposed to it. So yeah, it's that the other thing about the other thing is seems to me about when Foucault, for example, thought about selves and technologies of the self and care of the self, he was much more thinking about this kind of confessional, individual confession, speaking the truth about themselves. That was this kind of center of his thought. And he was critiquing that and as, in a sense, the welfare state. But I think what we're seeing now is much more technologies of the self, which are either on social media, but also in these public spaces that we're talking about, which are about not individual confession, but public kind of acts of contrition, acts of self-assertion that then place you amongst what I would call the virtuosi, those people who have become special, but through these public rituals. And it could be on social media as well. I mean, influencers and all of that type of stuff on Instagram.
But also within, it seems to me, in relation to your points earlier, when you brought up Weber as somebody who's mischaracterized as being a critic exclusively of the Iron Cage, when in fact he valued the credentialization of bureaucracy. It seems to me that these social media technologies, Silicon Valley and the sort of programmer class, are very suspicious of credentialization and create environments that are sort of where you would imagine that anti-elite sentiment would proliferate, because they reject that kind of the credentialed elite as being sort of antithetical to their sort of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps accomplishments. And these are the environments that have been created. And it's no coincidence that out of those environments grow movements of these sorts.
Well, they actually foster it because they bring in consultants who will give you kind of collective therapy to form yourself as a certain type of subject. But that's to get into a slightly different field. That would be the diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant.
Yes, we have those two at also in the Netherlands. But one point, because I was just remembering a piece actually from yesterday from the BBC about the Querdenk, and kind of noting that the German intelligence services have now, decided, to consider them as, a kind of a perilous organization, because their actions, quote, delegitimize the state, thereby threatening the constitution. So, it's not just us putting, kind of the anti-state rubric on them to analyze them. Security services, and the same is happening in the UK and in the US, where, these movements are becoming the object of surveillance. But one thing, and this is, thinking of one of the questions that's here, thinking about, the role of Christian democratic states. And I think, to me, this links to a broader question, and we've kind of brought it out in the discussion so far. We're talking about these movements that, yes, are visible in many places, but they're actually quite different. they're articulating their claims in very different ways, but also their presence, their popularity is very, very different. So the sort of mass protests that we have seen, certainly in the European context, in Germany and in Austria, have not been seen, in Italy, for example. I mean, there is, a variety of movements, but they're minuscule. And so I wonder, what is it about certain contexts? I mean, that in part, maybe can address, the question posed from the audience about different state traditions, different understandings of what the state is and what it should do. I mean, I'd be curious to get your response on that, Mitchell.
I think I mean, my first response is that I think that the German and Austrian perhaps cases are more concerning than perhaps the protests in Italy, and they bear some relationship to the kind of capital rioters as well. That that it wasn't simply these kind of marginalized, the so-called, in that the American case, there were people who were taking private planes, who were real estate brokers, who were on Facebook and Instagram taking pictures of themselves inside. It was a mixture of, so in both cases, a mixture of the kind of QAnon shaman type character, which you probably see in the German and Austrian cases as well, but also very extremely affluent people who would think don't have grievance. And so it's not, somehow you think, well, so having a better social state where you actually look after people better and have more security, it's not, maybe that's not going to have any impact as far as those kind of groups are concerned. And it seems, I mean, and I think I would say I haven't got a handle on the social basis of those kind of movements in that sense.
Mark, I mean, you've looked at some of them. I mean, this is really something, as I said, that's been troubling me, is trying to understand why in certain places and not in others. And I mean, and if you look certainly at the kind of external actors element, I mean, certainly, the support of external forces, to feeding these movements has been very pronounced. I mean, it has, as I said, been documented certainly in Germany and in the Netherlands. But that's, been feeding these movements. It didn't generate them. I mean, what's your sense? I mean, I don't know if, if your research shows you anything on that.
Yeah, it's the word, they're very, I think they're often quite diverse phenomenon, as Mitchell just pointed out. So there's the kind of cosmic right, who, as they've been called, who show up on the scene doing these kinds of these rituals of these kind of countercultural rituals, like the gathering of the tribes. And then there's all these other sort of the real estate agent in the private plane and so forth. The groups that I sort of were looking at, or the places that I was looking at least initially, that I still find really fascinating, are these environments online in which it isn't clear that people really believe in these things, that they're, like this already was clear when Trump got elected, that it's probably a quite small element of the base, but nevertheless, like an interesting subculture that we're just kind of in it for the kind of craziness of the whole thing, the fun, the countercultural element of it, which I think is very attractive. There is, I mean, in Amsterdam, there are like people showing up for a party in the Museumplein. And what you see in some of those online spaces is that, and I think there's also something about the way that the internet works, is that with memes and so forth, that it doesn't necessarily matter if people believe in them for them to circulate and for them to kind of do their work and get out there in the world. And that's also the case for I think for these these kind of bad actor propaganda, these like the Internet Research Agency and so forth, where it's just enough to sort of amplify all signals, instead of necessarily having a particular ideological investment in one outcome. As long as they're all kind of, there's more noise, then that leads to a certain kind of an outcome. So there's something very weird going on in some of these spaces where it's not necessarily about belief so much as just kind of circulation and churn of chaotic information and chaotic positions and anti-authoritarian positions for the sake of it. And that's something I've noticed.
I think, that's really interesting because, I mean, for sure, even observing is, I mean, there is this carnivalesque element to it, but some of these protests are actually quite violent. I mean, they have, I mean, in the United States, they were threatening public health figures from Anthony Fauci to, other health figures. I mean, there were attempts to bomb vaccination clinics also in the Netherlands. I mean, so, there is that carnivalesque element, but then there's also real violence and real attacks on public health figures.
There's no question about that.
I'm seeing there's, another question that's coming from the YouTube feed, asking, Mitchell, you actually, kind of thinking about the kind of the narcissism of some of this politics. And I'm thinking, I mean, that I think connects to, also what Mark has been saying about some of the dress-up protests.
Thanks for the question. It's something I've really been thinking about a lot, and I've been going back and actually thinking about, is it true that sometime in the late 1970s or something, a culture of narcissism took over, and that what we've got is the kind of world in which we live in today, in which the social media posts and the kind of addiction to going and checking how many likes you have on Instagram, and the whole phenomenon of influencers and all of that. And I think, yes, I think there is a certain narcissism in that way, and we could talk about a kind of culture of narcissism, but I actually don't, and I don't know that it's the only problem, the narcissistic problem. I think that narcissism suggests a kind of focus in simply on your promoting yourself, and what a great life I've got, and how I've got the best family, and I'm going on the best holidays and all of this kind of stuff. But the other side of it, I think, is that social media kind of amplifies, to use Mark's word, this a kind of identification. Even the simple thing of liking and all of that kind of stuff, liking things, liking posts, being constantly able to express your view about something, to form a kind of subjectivity through these kind of these minute digital interactions. There was no, and that if we cast our mind back to 2016, that was the kind of issue of both Brexit and the US election, the manipulation of people's simple kind of liking and the aggregation of that, and the ability to make kind of political interventions in relationship to that. So I think I think what we saw there, what I have made the claim anyway, is that what we saw there is that the kind of acclamations that are characteristic of the public sphere and public politics, and that in a sense used to also belong to the old media, migrated through a kind of technological threshold and intensified probably within the last 10 years in some sense. So it's not simply, there is a narcissistic element, and just to conclude, the kind of the third side of that is also this, the current focus on the enemy within, and addressing the enemy within, and expiating the kind of the sin of the enemy that's inscribed within one's identity, That's also another, not so much social media, but certainly a kind of morphing of the forms of subjectivity that political subjectivity that we're witnessing.
We've reached the allotted time limit for our discussion. And I feel that that was quite a nice point to leave off on. Would you like to make any kind of final statement? Perhaps, Luiza, is there anything that you'd like to?
You know what, I was just looking at the questions here. I think one regarding, kind of government spending too few resources combating conspiracies. They're waking up to this. I highly recommend you read the current issue of Nature, kind of a call to, governments to take these seriously, certainly in the US context, but not only. But I think, there is another question from our colleague Chiara De Cesari. How do we go beyond this language of state and anti-state? I mean, that's certainly the question that's troubling me. I think that's, the question that's been troubling this debate and brought it here. So to be continued, I would like to answer, kind of follow the rest of the series, but Mitchell, I'll hand over to you.
That's it's a very good question. I think, how do we get beyond it? I mean, intellectually or politically, I think we have to recognize, and I think this Esposito's recent work seems to be suggesting the same thing, that conflict is at the basis of the kind of societies in which we live. And the state and the set of institutions that developed were ones which were able to kind of mediate that conflict and to produce institutions out of that conflict. And he talks about instituting power in that kind of framework. And I do think that we have to recognize that the state and the state form is the place, is the locus, the key locus for political transformation, however one wants to think about that. And so I'm probably not going beyond the state, anti-state. You can accuse me of a bit of good old-fashioned statism or something.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I would like to invite our audience to please follow the rest of this series. And I would like to thank our two speakers this evening, Mitchell and Luiza. Thank you very much for a stimulating conversation. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your questions. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Mark, for a brilliant job of moderating, and thanks everyone for being with us.